Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it just a minute before we get started.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that folks may continue to trickle in. So whether you are new to Montessori or you've taught in a Montessori classroom for the last 20 years, you're in the right place. I have just a couple of housekeeping items that I wanted to go over before I introduce our panelist. So first of all, we're going to be recording this just so that you're aware. And periodically we'll pause for questions, and there's a questions tab in the panel to the right there. And actually, if we could go ahead and give that a try, if you could let us know if you are affiliated with one of the Guidepost Montessori campuses, if you could tell us which one. And if not, if you could tell us which city and state that you're joining from. It would be cool to learn a little bit more about who our audience is. You just go to the questions section. Let's see. We've got someone from New York City. We've got someone joining us from Dayton, Ohio. We've got Guidepost Montessori at Timber Ridge. We've got Guidepost in Naperville. Got some folks from Texas and Toronto. All right, great. We'll also have some time for discussion. So you'll see a little hand icon to raise your hand. And when we pause to do that, I'll just unmute you so that you can ask your question live. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Bateman, Dr. Matt Bateman. He received his Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania. And while there, he studied and wrote on the evolution of the scientific method in the cognitive sciences. He was a professor of psychology and philosophy at Franklin and Marshall College. And he has had 8 years of experience in Montessori education across all ages. He's currently the Vice President of Pedagogy at Guidepost Montessori, where he serves as both a trainer of Montessori guides, and he also helps with Montessori programming, support, and design. So I'm going to change over and let Matt get started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I'm really excited to be doing this. It's not that often that I get to talk about the topic of Montessori, which is very near and dear to my heart, from the perspective of my life as an academic, where I did a lot of thinking and work on what is it to do psychological research, kind of meaningful, effective research in the cognitive sciences, in a context where there's a lot that we don't know. It's a very young science, and we're not totally sure how the scientific method applies yet. And I think that that's definitely relevant here. If you're kind of interested in what does research tell us about Montessori, or about early childhood development, or about what preschool or what education system is the best for my child, kind of whatever is motivating you, there are going to end up being questions about kind of where is the research at, kind of what is the state of education research, how much can it tell us, how much can it not tell us, and is there any way that we can think about this in a way that's scientific more broadly, which will come up later in the talk. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now, just to give you a short overview. So this talk is titled Research and Beyond, because I do want to spend some time on reflecting critically on the research and thinking about how it applies in a more contextual, philosophical way. So the overview is of the talk is I want to first spend some time giving an overview of contemporary education research on Montessori and research that's relevant to Montessori. So there is some research. You should know what it is. If you're interested in this webinar, I want to tell you what it is. Then I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how Montessori approached her science of development and her science of pedagogy, and also how Montessori approached her philosophy of human development. She's a very philosophical thinker, and it can contextualize how you can think about research in science and how it does and doesn't inform decisions in thinking about early childhood education and early childhood development. So I'm just going to jump right in. So before I go into particular studies, there are really two categories of research that are relevant to Montessori. So one is researchers that are directly interested in studying the effectiveness of the Montessori method. So research on Montessori. How does Montessori compare to non-Montessori education? So you kind of divide up the education landscape into Montessori and non-Montessori, and then say, on what measures is Montessori more effective? On what measures is Montessori less effective? What does the research show? There are not that many studies that do this. There are some, and I'm going to go over a sample of them. Some of them are pretty good. They number in the dozens, I would say, probably the low dozens, maybe like 30, 40, 50 studies, kind of published peer-reviewed studies on Montessori, maybe more, maybe even as many as 100 in the last few years. There's been a burst of interest, but there's not that many, and there's reasons for this. It's not. Some of the reasons are that Montessori it's like a grassroots movement that's just kind of now making its way into the research mainstream. But it's even apart from that, it's not that easy to research an entire radical philosophical approach to education wholesale. So just take a couple of issues. So one is that the category of Montessori, you can identify, like, let's say that you could identify what are quality Montessori programs and how are we going to compare, and we want to kind of group them together and consider the students and the practices and do research on those. That is tricky, but it's possible. The category of non-Montessori is very diverse, very, very diverse. It ranges from, a kindercare to that kind of is going to reflect the pedagogy of whatever teachers are there, to public school, to all the variants within public school, to Waldorf and Reggio education, to other kinds of modes of alternative education. All of that falls under the heading of non-Montessori. It's not that easy to identify a clear contrast to Montessori education. And within that non-Montessori bucket, a lot of educational approaches have been very influenced by Montessori. And so it's not a clean comparison. You can have very child-centered approaches, or approaches that are very hands-on learning, or approaches that draw inspiration from Montessori in different ways. So it's hard to get a kind of comparison class. So that's one challenge. But the bigger challenge is it's not that easy to design an experiment around Montessori that actually is a fair sample without confounds of Montessori students and Montessori education. People that select Montessori education tend to be people, not always, but they tend to be people that are willing to pay for education, that kind of go into private education, that are interested in alternative pedagogies, that are very thoughtful and philosophical and perhaps countercultural about parenting. So within Montessori education, there's this cluster of things that tends to go along with it. And that cluster of things, like parents who read a bunch of books about parenting and are very philosophical about parenting and think about alternative pedagogies for parenting, that is going to impact the child. Even whether or not that child goes to a Montessori school, having parents that are like that is going to impact the child. Parent SES, socioeconomic status, is going to impact the child's outcomes. The kinds of things that you would measure in a study are affected by things that correlate with Montessori education. And so it's hard to get a crisp, clean view on it. And that, I think, it's selection bias, in a word, is the biggest challenge in Montessori research. And this is not unique to Montessori, which I'll talk about in a bit. It's a problem in education research. That said, those are all caveats and addendums. We'll return to some of them in a bit. But there is research on Montessori, so what is it? I'm going to give you a brief overview of three of, I think, pretty representative studies of the better studies on Montessori education. And you'll get a sense for how this research goes. Just so you know, there's two really good overviews, a shorter one and a longer one, that you can look at if you want a more comprehensive dive into those dozens of studies, and to kind of go through them one by one. One is this review paper in Nature Reviews, I think, or Nature Reviews on Learning, by Chloe Marshall on Montessori education, a review of the evidence base. It's from 2017, I think. It's a good critical overview of the research on Montessori, and it also frames what Montessori education is. The other one is this book by Angeline Lillard called Montessori, The Science Behind the Genius. It just came out with a second edition. It's a very comprehensive overview of Montessori research. She herself is a very well-known developmentalist at the University of Virginia. She's one of the leading thinkers on Montessori, and she synthesizes the research very compellingly, both the pluses and the negatives. She's very fair on the research. It's a book, it's very accessible. It's something that I would recommend to anybody who's more interested in this topic. Okay, so this is this Willard and Elsa Quest paper from 2007. I think it was published in Science. Is one of the most cited and probably the most well-designed study of the effectiveness of Montessori education. It's effective particularly because she managed to design the study in a way that got a truly random sample. So she worked with a school district that assigned students to schools by a lottery system. So it was a kind of charter system that used a lottery system to determine where students went. And so she picked a sample of students that all wanted to go to a Montessori school, but it was random, determined by lottery whether or not they did. And that cuts through a lot of confounds. It makes it so that it's not the parents' SES or the parents' philosophy or whatever that's making the difference. The only thing that's making the difference is this lottery system. So it's what we call a randomized control trial, which is the gold standard in this kind of research, which is very, very, very hard to do. And she took students at the age of 5 and then at the age of 11, I think, towards the end of elementary. And she ran them through a cognitive battery, a kind of standard set of cognitive science tasks that we use to measure developmental performance in certain academic areas, and also what we call executive functioning. So the child's capacity to kind of control their own mind and be disciplined and pay attention to what they want to pay attention to, and to switch their attention to something else when they want to switch attention to it. There's this kind of inner muscle that you use. You can kind of think about it as analogous to willpower. And that's something that cognitive scientists have gotten pretty good at measuring. There are other things that they measured as well. The false belief test, which is a test of how advanced children are at thinking about empathy, at reasoning about, at social reasoning, at understanding the perspectives of others, how often they refer to justice, shared play, how creative the children are in their storytelling. And on every measure, Montessori students did considerably better, like significantly better than the students who got randomly assigned to the non-Montessori school. The letter word sort, the word attack, the applied math, these are basic academic functions, and then the executive and social functions as well. The only inverted score here is ambiguous rough play, which is a measure of how students potentially conflicting and potentially aggressive, potentially problematic play kind of in social settings. There's a way that cognitive scientists have to measure that. On that, Montessori students were lower. On everything else, they were higher. And these are pretty well trotted out, well understood measures. So these are the kinds of measures that they're not weird. They're the kinds of measures that you would use to assess any kind of developmental program or an individual, even if you're trying to assess kind of where they are in their progress. This is the only, there might be one or two others. This is the only study that I know of that's this well designed, where you're really cutting through the confounds. And I think it's a small sample, so it's in one school and one public school system. This is one of the criticisms of the study. It's hard to know exactly how well it generalizes. But I mean, the kind of one RCT that we have is pretty compelling evidence in favor of the effectiveness of Montessori education on measures that pretty much every educator and parent is concerned with. Here's a second study. This one is from France, and I'm going to mispronounce the names here, but Sloane and Lou Barn did a study where they compared children on measures of creativity. Creativity is another area that cognitive scientists have come up with cool ways to measure, and it's something that a lot of parents and a lot of educators care about. Are we fostering creativity in our children? So these tasks are, they're a little bit different. I can just read you the description of them. So the cardboard task is unusual uses for a cardboard box. In this task, the child must name orally as many different uses as he or she can make with one or several boxes, time allowed 3 minutes. So that's the box task on this slide. Improvement on a toy. We present an elephant toy to the child. This toy does not have accessories. It is uniformly gray and in the sitting position. The child is asked to imagine how to make this toy funnier and more entertaining. So they're given a boring toy and the child is asked to make it funnier and more entertaining. The child has to name orally all of his or her ideas in 3 minutes. Parallel lines is, there's a figural material that the child is provided with, and they have to kind of turn these parallel lines into components of a drawing, as many as they can within 10 minutes. And then the output of this is measured on criteria that are normed by trained raters. The sample in this is not random. So schools were picked kind of across France. There was a Montessori school in France with, I think, 112 students, and then a Freinet school, which is another alternative form of education. And then there were 2 traditional schools picked, one in the suburbs, and one in the urban center of Paris. It faces the kinds of criticisms and weaknesses that a lot of these studies do. It's not a random sample. What made the parents pick a Montessori school? What made them pick alternative school? Are those potential confounds? But this is a pretty typical study on Montessori. Most studies have these sample problems, and most of them are pretty favorable to Montessori. If you look at the results, the Montessori students do very well on the dependent variables, as well or better than students in the suburban schools, in the Paris schools, or in the Freinet schools. This is the kind of sum total of the score on the dependent variables. The dependent variables are just how did the students do on average on these tests. The parallel lines task is something that Montessori students particularly excelled at, but then all of the tasks that are at or above average relative to the other groups. And then I just have one more study just to kind of round it out to give you a sense of what the research on Montessori looks like. This one is from Dorman and colleagues from 2007. And they did research on high school students. This is not in a Montessori high school, in a public high school. And they sorted the students at this high school on whether or not they attended at least some number of years in a Montessori elementary and a Montessori preschool. So these are public high school students that are all in the same program, and they were sorted based on whether or not they went to a Montessori school. This is not a random sample, because why did they go to the Montessori school? All the same confounds exist. To get around that, the researchers did what a lot of researchers in the social sciences do. This is common in economics research and psychology research. They tried to match each Montessori student with a non-Montessori student who was similar on as many metrics as possible, on achievement, on socioeconomic status, on gender, on everything that they could find to match them on to kind of eliminate noise. And it is a helpful technique. And the results are pretty good for Montessori. Montessori students don't do significantly worse on anything, and they do significantly better on math and science years later. So this is, 8 years later-ish, somewhere between 4 and 8 years later, depending on when the students stop their Montessori experience, and the students are showing differentiated math scores. There are other effects too, and it's worth knowing that. You'll see on the slide, there's gender effects, there's ethnicity effects, there's effects of socioeconomic status, which is usually measured by things like free lunch. And those effects some of those effects are significant, and some of those effects are bigger than the Montessori effects. So this is the kind of thing that you typically see in education research. But Montessori is significantly different. It helps with GPA, but not significantly. It helps significantly and noticeably with math and science. And English and social studies, it's about the same. There's a slight negative difference, but it's insignificant. Before I go to this slide, where does this leave us with Montessori? What are the kind of takeaways and conclusions? I think the main takeaway is that this is representative. There are a few dozen studies that are like this. Not all, most of the data is quite favorable to Montessori. Not all of it is. Some of it is more mixed. There are debates about why that is and kind of how to kind of get better research on it. I think that the takeaway here is that you know, a lot of people come to science, psychology, neuroscience, the cognitive sciences, education research, looking for pretty hard answers. Science is it's a very successful human endeavor. It's the one area in human life where like we can turn to some method, some sort of virtuous way of thinking for answers. We have 400 years of results from science that shape our world and make our lives better and better, and really seem to track the truth increasingly over time. We're at the beginning stages of that in direct research on Montessori. The research that exists is pretty minimal, but it's favorable. And that's kind of what the state of things is. This is true across education research. So this is, again, not unique to Montessori. The second category of Montessori research that I'm just going to go over very briefly is research that is not on Montessori. So research that is not directed towards Montessori versus non-Montessori schools, but research that is directed to how children learn more generally, and then that you can apply indirectly to Montessori. So for example, what does research tell us about the best ways to learn how to read and write? The best method of, what does the kind of science tell us about literacy? And literacy is an area where there is an abundance of education research and where there are actually consensus results that have emerged over time. It's one of the more well-researched areas of education. What do those practices, like, okay, so now we know from that, what is good in literacy, kind of how to teach students literacy. What happens in a Montessori classroom? What does the Montessori approach say about literacy, and how does that compare to what researchers say you should learn about literacy? So it's kind of indirect research. And there are a few different areas that I think are interesting and relevant to know about. So one is literacy education, which I just mentioned. This is a super brief synopsis that doesn't do this research area justice, but the consensus view is there are two things that really help. One is a phonics approach that breaks down literacy into a phonetic system and treats it really systematically, step by step, with sound games and associating phonemes with graphemes, the whole 9 yards. If you approach it systematically, it really helps with literacy outcomes. The second thing that really helps with literacy outcomes is vocabulary. It's knowing stuff. So if you read a book and every other word you have to look up because you don't know what the word is, most of your cognitive resources are going towards trying to understand the material, and your cognitive resources can't kind of grapple with the reading comprehension, the mechanical elements of the reading. And so one of the things that helps the most in literacy is actually knowing stuff. And this is, I mean, this is borne out in all sorts of research. It's borne out in the way that SAT tutoring companies prepare you for the SAT. These two things, having a systematic approach to phonics and building your content knowledge, are the two pillars. And Montessori very, very explicitly takes a systematic phonics approach. It is one of the most systematic and most phonics-based approaches in all of education. And children are learning a ton of content and vocabulary in what is called the culture areas of the classroom from very early on. Montessori thought that children should be learning Latin roots for scientific and mathematical terms in Children's House, in preschool. And there's a certain way that that's motivated and related to their own experience, but that crystallized vocabulary and content knowledge is a huge part of Montessori. Very, very favorable, I think. For math education research, this research is a little bit more diverse. Two things that I think stand out are students who at a young age learn to verbally recognize mathematical concepts that they experience in their environment. So students who can point at something and say, that's a cylinder, young children. That tracks very, very excellent math outcomes. Math interventions that focus on giving students that vocabulary tend to do very well. So relating the student's experience of math with vocabulary that they can deploy. And then the second thing is that students actually really understand certain things about pretty complicated mathematical operations. So you're not just learning an algorithm, you're not just learning column addition or column multiplication, or that when you multiply two fractions, or when you divide a fraction by a fraction, you multiply by the inverse. You just learn the rule and you don't understand how it works. It really helps to understand how it works, and particularly in basic operations, and particularly with fractions is a hugely researched area that predicts a lot of math outcomes. Again, Montessori is very good on these subjects. There's an excellent, exceptional sequence of math materials. What math materials in Montessori are what get a lot of people excited about Montessori. And they are designed to give students precisely these things. A couple of other areas. One is, I've kind of grouped a bunch of things together that you could arguably divide apart. The idea that it's important to have like a growth mindset, that it's important to have persistence, that it's important to have good executive functioning skills that we mentioned earlier. These things can kind of come apart, but they all go together under the category of how do you fundamentally use your mind, and what's your fundamental perspective on your own learning? There is a lot of research that suggests that a student's ability to persist, to have grit, or to be friendly with failure, to learn something and make a mistake and then get right back up and do it again and think that that's fine and normal and not be too hard on yourself. These things are really predictive of academic excellence. They're really predictive of all the measures that we looked at earlier that, that cognitive scientists typically use. And this is an area where it's an ongoing question as to what interventions there are that help students develop these things. So how do you actually teach a student to have a growth mindset? How do you give them grit? How do you help their executive functioning research or executive functioning skills develop? Montessori, if you're new to Montessori, if you know Montessori, you'll know that the whole Montessori experience is designed to teach these things. As literacy is taught, as math is taught, as different knowledge areas are taught, different skills are taught, the kind of fundamental underlying thing that underscores all of Montessori education from birth through adulthood is the development of independence, of this growth mindset, of persistence, of control over your own mind, of inner discipline. It's a centerpiece of Montessori, and that it's one of the differentiating features of Montessori. So insofar as this is important, I think we would expect that, yeah, this is one of the reasons why Montessori does have good research outcomes and why Montessori is a good thing. Very, very quickly, there's a whole other set of theories and areas of research that you go into that are related to Montessori attachment theory. How is it that children form basic relationships with people around them, and how does that affect how they value and their relationships in the future? Dynamical systems theory and fine motor control research. How do students relate to the environment? How does the intelligence relate to the development of motor control? There's developmental neuroscience. There's a lot of research that is peripherally relevant to Montessori that it seems like comports with a lot of what Montessori says, but hasn't been specifically applied to Montessori. In general, my view is that this research corroborates the Montessori approach. For example, fine motor control is it's one of these things that's very predictive of academic excellence. It's predictive of the development of intelligence. It's something that it's surprisingly good how good a child is at using his or her hands and fingers to manipulate fine objects. Seems to be very important for the development of fundamental executive functioning and intelligence and academic excellence later on. And again, Montessori is very focused on fine motor control. To a fault it is. Students are using small manipulatives in an extremely precise way, and they're encouraged to use them very, very precisely, not just as toys, but with precise learning and building tasks. Starting from very, very young. So that's the research around Montessori. I think it's worth mentioning the research that isn't being done, kind of in the same breath as the research that is being done. So if you're a kind of Montessori educator or Montessori parent or Montessori is something that you're interested in, I have this flow chart. This is something that the education researcher Dan Willingham made and posted to his social media, actually. that's about independence. So if you look at the flow chart, he made this graphic because he was frustrated. He was talking to a friend that was like, how do you get your children to make lunch or do laundry, or like, oh, there's so much to do for children and it's so annoying and it's so overwhelming. And Dan William was like, well, have the child do it. And how do you do that? Well, it's pretty simple. You take an approach to child rearing or to education where you're on the premise of figuring out whether or not the child can do the task by himself or herself, and if so, asking the child to do it. And if they can't, figuring out what minimum things that they need, what minimum bits of help that they need in order to start doing it independently. The idea here is that you're on a quest to make the child more and more independent over time, and that this is something that's very important in development. So why do I bring this up here? I bring this up here because this is an essential feature of Montessori education. This is what she was on fire about. How do we make children more independent over time? It's what a lot of Montessori parents care about. It's what a lot of parents outside of Montessori care about. And it is not that easy to research. There is no measure of independence that you can easily apply to kind of figure out, are Montessori children actually more independent or not? Can you do a randomized control trial? Can you do an experiment? Can you kind of assess things with scientific evidence and figure out, does it actually help? Anecdotally, it helps. It seems obvious that it would help. It seems obvious that it's very important, but there just isn't a measure of it. There's only indirect measures and kind of roundabout measures of it, and then ethnographies and other kinds of ways that you can look at something like independence. This issue of kind of what are we measuring, if I go back a couple slides, this is, the letter, how students do on a Woodcock-Johnson letter word task, how they do on a card sort task, how they do on a false belief test. These things matter. I think that they're getting at things that matter, but it's only a partial representation of what matters, and that's relevant if you're a parent or an educator thinking about what does the research say about Montessori education. There are aspects of Montessori education that you probably care about a lot and want to know about, on which the research is totally silent. We just haven't figured out how to research it yet. If you're interested in this general topic of education research, there are two excellent books that I would recommend. One is by Dan Willingham, the guy whose chart I just stole from my slide, called When Can You Trust the Experts? How to Tell Good Science from Bad in Education. He's very good on, where's education research at? How can you be thoughtful about it? What does the science tell you? What does it not tell you? The second is a book by, I've never met her and I don't know how to pronounce her name, Ellen Lageman, I think. Ellen Condorf-Lageman. It's a history of education research. It's a kind of critical history of education research. It's more academic. It's called An Elusive Science. But it's very fascinating. I mean, you'll learn a lot from that book if you're kind of willing to sink your teeth into it. Education research is young. There's a lot that we want to know from it that we don't know already. What the research does tell us about Montessori is generally favorable, not unambiguously favorable, but generally favorable. And that's kind of where we're at with it. I want to move on in a minute to how to think about science and education a little bit more broadly, how Montessori thought of herself as a scientist. But before I do that, I wanted to pause and see if you guys had any questions about the scientific research. There's a lot of research that I'm glossing over. I can probably point you towards things, or if you have specific questions about does the research show something, I might know the answer, I might not. I'm not totally a comprehensive master of this research, but you're joining a webinar on science of Montessori, so you should be able to ask me your questions.
Matt, we've had a couple of questions that came in while you were talking. One of them was about the Lillard study, and it asked, can you say what letter word, word attack, and card sort mean again? Yeah, so these are standard, they're used partially because cognitive scientists have used them a lot. They're very well validated measures. So let me just go over one of them that I'm the most familiar with, the card sort task. So the card sort task is a task where students are subjects, participants in the study, you can do this with adults too, are given cards with a representation on it that will be like, it'll be like a red elephant or a pink monkey or a green monkey. It'll be an object that has different properties kind of all combined together. And you'll get a bunch of these cards in a row. So you might draw one card and it's like a red elephant, and you draw the next card and it's a green monkey.
What the card sort task asks you to do is it says, only select cards that are red. And then you do that for a while. And how fast do you do it? How accurately do you do it? And then it says, only select cards that are red and not a monkey. Okay, that's a little bit harder. Like you have to kind of, okay, you have to hold multiple things in mind. It's also the task switches. So you've just as you've kind of automated the red thing, it's telling you to kind of switch your mental mode, which means you have to undo the habit that you just learned. And it gets more and more and more complicated. It's kind of arbitrarily complicated. It's a measure of executive functioning. It's a measure of like, how much can you hold in your head? How quickly can you implement what you have in your head to action? How speedily do you do it? How accurately do you do it? This is an example of executive functioning skills. The others, the letter attack, the word attack, they look more like vocabulary tests, kind of more like academic tests. The false belief test is it's a little bit more complicated. It's like you put the child in a situation where they observe what's happening. Here's my favorite example of the false belief test. It's worth knowing this just because it's so cute. This is false belief about preferences. You take a 2-year-old, you put them in a room, and there's a fish tank in the room. This is I think this is a Linda Smart study. I may be getting this wrong. The researcher wrong, but the study is right. And the researcher leaves the room and says, I'm going to come back with a snack for you in a few minutes. So this 2-year-old child or 3-year-old child is alone in the room. And the researchers have they have a mic hooked up near the fish tank. And the researcher starts to imitate out through a speaker, like a graduate assistant or something, is like, hey, Johnny, come over here. So they're pretending to be the fish. This is a very strange study. And Johnny comes over to the fish tank. And then the researcher says through the mic, Johnny, I'm the fish in the tank. And you know what? Every day they come in and I really want to eat broccoli, but they always give me cookies. So they're going to bring in a tray with broccoli and cookies. Can you please tell them that I want the broccoli and not the cookies? And the 2-year-old is like, okay, like they just accept this because they're 2. And so the researcher comes back in and with the tray, and they say, oh, I have a tray for you. Do you want broccoli or cookies? And then the 2-year-old chooses, and then they say, oh, it's also time to feed the fish. What should we feed the fish? And a young child will always say cookies. It's not comprehensible to them that somebody thinks in a fundamentally different way than they do. They kind of conflate their view with other people's view. And it kind of exactly at what point and in what domains this rolls over varies by the age of the child. And there's things that you can do with children to kind of help them along faster. It's pretty developmentally canalized. Like there's a pretty set path as to what ages you realize different things. But as you saw, like Montessori children tend to do better on more advanced versions of the false belief test younger, which is interesting. They have empathy skills. That was a very long answer to a very short question. What's the next question?
Next question is there any research pertaining to the impact of Montessori on infants specifically? And then also, what about children of elementary age and above?
There is much more research on children of elementary age or above. That's actually one of the more well-researched areas because you can start to use, because the K-12 world is just a kind of more established world. Everybody goes to school in elementary school. It's just expected. It's easier to kind of get a sample. When there's a Montessori school, often it's integrated with the public school system. The first study that I cited was really good. The randomized control trial study was on elementary students, and there are as many studies about that as I think preschool students. And I haven't done a comprehensive survey. I have not seen a single study about Montessori infant programs, not one. And I don't think it's because I've just missed it. I mean, I've read a lot of kind of meta-analyses of the literature. I think it would have popped out at me. Infant NETO programs, like programs for students 18 months and younger, they're rare. And if they were going to be studied, they would have to be approached from the perspective of kind of really pretty strict developmental psychology. It's very rare to even think about this as an education system. And so, like, what would you be comparing it with? Like other kinds of group care, nanny care? But I mostly just think it's just not on researchers' radars in the same way. Not yet, anyway. It's a good question. If you wanted to look at in research on infants that was relevant to Montessori and think about how that works, I would look at the fine motor control research. And then I would look at attachment theory. Attachment theory is one of the most, if not the most, kind of well-developed intervention-based clinical, scientific, evidentially grounded method, kind of psychological theories out there. It's got 40 years of research. I think it relates in all sorts of interesting ways to Montessori, including NIDO programs.
There's the question about what about Montessori versus Waldorf versus Reggio methodology?
I have not found any great, I've not found any direct comparisons of those. They probably exist. When you're doing that kind of comparison, it's even harder to overcome sample bias, selection bias, basically. Those problems are going to be greatly magnified. The problems of having a small sample size are going to be greatly magnified. Here's a couple of things that I do know from a survey of the literature. I'd have to kind of pull out the studies for citations. In general, Reggio and Waldorf education is more optimized for creativity, whereas Montessori, in certain ways, it's optimized for creativity, but in other ways, it's about precision and connecting with reality and kind of building basic skills and interdiscipline. It's a different ethos. As you might expect, Reggio and Waldorf students tend to do better on measures of creativity, especially for the association measures like the box task that I mentioned earlier, where you're given a cardboard box and you have to come up with as many ways to use it in a certain time, and then it's graded on a norm task. The ranking is basically like Reggio and Waldorf children do better on those tasks somewhat than Montessori children, who do better than those tasks in children in, generic traditional preschool, which is a nebulous category. I don't know of a single study that I would say is like super well designed on that score, but that's kind of where it falls out.
Let's see. There's another one that says, is there anything in that super long-term, multi-generational Harvard study that examines the kind of early childhood education the subjects received?
I know what study you're referring to, and I would have to go back and look at it in detail. Off of the top of my head, no. I don't think that that's what they were tracking in that study. It was more, yeah, I would have to go back and look. It's the short answer. I don't want to muse.
And then there's one that says, will you post and share these references so we can look them up? I'm happy to relay that through a follow-up email. I can collect it from that afterwards.
Yeah, totally. I can post all these references. I should have just had it on the slide. I have the APA style references, which maybe aren't as helpful. Some of them are behind paywalls, like they're not all that easy to get. The Lillard study you can definitely get on the internet in general, even if you don't have a university subscription. The Lillard book is again, it's cheap, it's available, you can get it on one day on Amazon. It has virtually, there's an edition that came out like this summer, I think, this past summer. It's less than a year old. It's very up to date and kind of more comprehensive than what I'm doing here. It's the best reference work on this subject. And that's definitely the thing that I would recommend starting with. And she has copious documentation of additional references. But yeah, we can send out the resources. Yeah.
For sure. I think that's it for right now, but we can come back a little bit later.
Okay. So I just wanted to talk a little bit, I don't have as many slides for this, on science in a kind of broader sense than what I've been talking about. So what we've been talking about is research that's aimed at being experimental, ideally being a highly refined form of experiment called a randomized control trial. Where you're trying to eliminate as many confounds as possible, where you're measuring on very well understood metrics that kind of integrate with other studies and that you know how they integrate with other metrics. You're doing what Kuhn called normal science in the contemporary mode in the social sciences. Montessori considered herself a scientist, and I think she was right to consider herself a scientist. Before any of that, before there was even the inkling of applying those methods to education, and even to psychology. So she was a pioneer in scientific developmental psychology and scientific pedagogy. So how did she do it? She did it by she did a couple of things. One is that she was very, very good at kind of deprogramming herself from taking easily knowable and observable facts that everybody takes for granted for granted. So she didn't take those things that everybody takes for granted. And I think that this was a special talent of hers. So just to take one example that is now very, very obvious and a huge part of developmental psychology. There's a whole field to it devoted to it, developmental linguistics. So just take language. It is obvious that every child learns a language, and it is pretty obvious that nobody teaches them a language. They get it by kind of absorbing it from their environment. This is how every child learns their native tongue. And you can even observe specific things about how children do this. If you're observant, children of a certain age will look at adults' mouths. They're very drawn to human speech. If they hear even if you can take like a 6-month-old, and if they hear, I feel like in a 6-month-old, if there's a 6-month-old in a stroller, like in an elevator or something with you, and you know a foreign language, just try starting to speak in that language, and children will like dehabituate and immediately pay attention. They sense that there's something different. Children are very, very attuned to language. And it's obvious, but it's remarkable. I mean, if you try to learn a language as an adult, you need flashcards and grammar rules, and it is a long and painful process, and children kind of get it for free. And they don't just get it by imitation, they get it by learning the grammar. They get it by learning this deep, abstract structure of the language that they can then use to generate new sentences that nobody has even said to them, not by imitation, but by kind of, this is what's called generative grammar now. It's the kind of more you dwell on this, the more remarkable it is. It's like, what is going on in the child's mind? How does it structure that? Is it kind of specialized for this special abstraction function of getting rules from language? And there's a lot of evidence around this. So this is something that Noam Chomsky was famous for kind of pointing out and developing a whole theory and a whole field around in the late 50s, early 60s. Montessori made a huge stink about exactly these same points. Like this is a scientific point. It is a point of observational reflection and very careful observation, and kind of not taking for granted something that's obvious about how children learn, that has, once you start really delving into it and theorizing about it, wider implications for how children learn. I mean, her view, this is one example that led her to believe that children just in general don't learn consciously. In general, learn subconsciously and unconsciously with a special kind of mind that she called the observant mind, and there's a whole theory around that. There is evidence for that theory. It is not just a made-up theory. It is kind of based on a systematic series of observations. It's just they're not based on experimental observations. They're based on ordinary, everyday observations. So that's one set of things that she did. Another set of things that she did is she ran kinds of experiments. So she was an educator. And you can try things out as an educator and get data from reality. It's not an experiment in the sense of you have controlled all of the conditions except for one, and you're going to do this one thing, and then you're going to measure the result, and that one result is going to confirm or disconfirm your hypothesis and inform your theory. So it's not an experiment in the sense that you learn about experiments in a science class, but it is like, let's see of this range of materials what children gravitate towards and what they do with it. And then let's swap out some of the materials. And then let's make it so that children can choose their own materials, and let's see what happens. She approached the development of her pedagogy observationally, and she tried things out and she changed them when they didn't work. And there are things that surprised her. When she first started as an educator, she had a bunch of learning materials, a bunch of practical life materials, and a bunch of toys. And eventually she ended up eliminating the toys because she found that children were less drawn to them. This was a kind of natural experiment. There were things about children that she did not expect that children would be able to concentrate for very long periods of time. That was not her expectation going in. One of the features of Montessori education is that it optimizes for that kind of concentration. So Montessori was a scientific thinker in a broad sense, and she iterated and developed her pedagogy over time. And one reason to go into Montessori education or to select a Montessori school for your child is that it is a pedagogy that's based on 100 years of practical refinement. It is one of the oldest developmental pedagogy that still has staying power. That's kind of like stuck around for as long as it has. That's gone through ongoing refinement. That was grounded in this kind of careful developmental observation and developmental theorizing. And it shows. I think it really shows in the kind of the finickiness of Montessori educators with preferring one material over another. That finickiness comes from decades and decades of accumulated experience of what children can learn from and what they prefer. It's not research validated, so it's not scientific in that sense. It wouldn't meet the metric. You couldn't publish it. But it's also a mistake to think that it's just a kind of arbitrary thing and we don't really know anything. We know a lot there, and Montessori knew a lot there. And that leads me to one last point, and then I will take some questions. I have a slide for this. Get my slides back up. So I think it's worth noting that Montessori was a philosopher, not just a scientist. And so you'll get what I mean by that by reading a quote. I'll read this quote with you guys. So this is from Spontaneous Activity in Education, which is also publishes the Advanced Montessori Method. Now the little child who manifests his perseverance in his work as the first constructive act of his psychical life. So this is a child who's concentrating really hard and trying to do something for a long period of time. And upon this act builds internal order and equilibrium, and the growth of personality demonstrates almost as in splendid revelation the true manner in which man renders himself valuable to the community. The little child who persists in his exercises, concentrated and absorbed, is obviously elaborating the constant man, the man of character, the man who will find in himself all human values, crowning that unique fundamental manifestation, persistence in work. This is a really, really important idea. I mean, there's a lot of important ideas in this passage, but just to touch on a couple. She has a view of adult life that if you want to be a man of character, a man or a human of character, to use use kind of more modern language, a man or a woman of character, a man or a woman who finds in himself or herself all human values. Fundamental to that is you need to have a capacity for work. You need to have a work ethic. You need to be able to persist through challenges. You need to have a certain kind of inner discipline. Is that a scientific idea? Is that an idea from science? I mean, it's not anti-scientific. It's not unrelated to things that you might observe. It's not unrelated to evidence about human well-being and studies that you could do. But first and foremost, it's a philosophical idea. It's an idea. It's a view as to what constitutes the good life. What constitutes a kind of flourishing adult life? She has very strong views on this. She thinks that you need to be independent. She thinks that you need to know a lot of stuff. She thinks that you need to be able to connect to other people from a place of confidence. I mean, that's really important to me, is that you need a certain work ethic. And a lot of her educational system is design thinking, like back into childhood. Okay, given what we know about childhood, and given what we know makes a good adult life, how should we educate children? How should we educate children to kind of foster those values over time in a developmentally appropriate and gradual way? What makes those values good? I mean, I think that there is kind of, in a sense, you can think about that evidentially, but this is where you have to reflect as a parent and an educator. What do I believe makes a life good? Part of what you're evaluating education systems on is that scientific research, education research, even 100 years from now, will never kind of answer the question, what makes a good human life? This is something that you have to have a view on as an educator and as a parent coming into education, and this is part of what you're evaluating an education system on. So lots to think about and talk about there. I mean, the general takeaway, I think, in this talk, Montessori, the research and beyond, the research is young, it's a little bit thin. What's there is very favorable to Montessori. Like, it does reflect well on Montessori. I don't want you to walk away thinking that the research doesn't conclude anything about Montessori. It does, and it's pretty good for Montessori. It's not determinative, and you're going to want to integrate and reflect upon your values as a parent and an educator. And also, you want to be a scientist yourself. You want to think, what do I know about children? What am I confident about children? Kind of apart from what the research tells us, there's a need for scientific thinking in the sense that Montessori did it, in a broader sense than experimental research. And I think it's better to just kind of embrace that, you're going to be making judgments about children and what's good for children that are evidence responsive, and you're going to try things out, and you're going to see what works and what doesn't. And that is, that's the kind of game that we're all playing. And Montessori is in some ways just a very, very, very refined version of that. So thank you for coming to my talk, and I would love to stay around for as long as you want and take questions.
We have a question about what makes Guidepost Montessori a good choice.
It's a great question. We take at Guidepost this idea of getting education right, kind of being developmentalists in education, and taking this idea of Montessori is that you should observe very carefully, and you should take a scientific approach, and you should be sensitive to evidence. We take it very, very seriously. It's part of our programming. We have an internal training for our teachers, an in-house training that's very worked out, very high quality Montessori training that makes it so that our teachers know what to look for. They have a view on what developmental psychology tells us, how that impacts pedagogical practice, and how that impacts each particular child. They have coaching and support on that. I think Kelly gives some of that coaching and support, so we should talk a little bit about that. But there's a whole network and infrastructure. It's a mission-oriented organization that's basically about taking education really seriously and getting it right. I think if you go to one of our schools and you see it and you observe it, I think you'll see that immediately. So I would encourage you to go to a local Guidepost and to check it out and to observe and to talk to the educators, and you'll see this kind of thoughtfulness and quality and integrity to Montessori principles that, again, the research does bear pretty well on. So, yeah.
Another very practical question, how can I find out if there's a Guidepost Montessori near me?
There's a website, guidepostmontessori.com. I think if you just go there, it'll list all of the locations, and if it doesn't just list all the locations, in the waffle menu at the top, when you click it, if you click on locations, there will be another list of the locations. And there is even, Kelly, can you speak to this? Isn't there like a parent pioneer portal somewhere that, like, if there's not a Guidepost near you, you can fill out a form and maybe we can work with you to open one. And we have 50 schools. We're growing at 20 to 30 a year. It's a pretty rapidly growing network, and we want to know where there's interest.
Yeah, you can actually email community@tohigherground.com if you'd like to know more, or visit guidepostmontessori.com/parent-pioneer. Let's see, we just got another question that came in. It says, how informative is a familiarity of early education, say preschool to elementary, for learning by adults and vice versa? In other words, are we as adults fundamentally different learners compared to young children?
In certain respects, I think we are. And this is a theme in Montessori. Certainly kind of Montessori's view, and this is a view that's borne out in other developmental research, this is no longer just her view, but the view that she pioneered is that children in the 0 to 5, 0 to 6 age, their minds work in a different way than adults learn. The best example that I can give of this is, a year or two ago, I learned how to ski. I went skiing for the first time. And I went to a ski school, and there was an awesome instructor. He taught me how to ski. He told me kind of like what to hold in my mind and what to practice as I went on the ski school over and over. It's like, bend your legs, Matt, bend your goddamn legs, over and over. He would tell me, and I would focus on that, and I would stick with it. And after a week of like him telling me different things, first bend your legs, now make a pizza shape with your skis. Here's how you use your poles. One by one, we kind of go through the things and we practice them. And I consciously focus on them, and by the end, I could go down like the bunny hill without dying. Towards the end of the week, a couple of 4-year-olds were learning how to ski at the ski school, and they didn't get any instruction, and they were skiing better than I was in 15 minutes. It's a different kind. They couldn't go through the same process that I went through. Like if you were like, kid, bend your legs, like they would just ignore you. But there's something that they can learn much more rapidly. And so Montessori described this as conscious versus subconscious learning. There are also parallels and similarities, so it's not just totally differences, but there are major differences between how a 9-year-old learns things and how a 3-year-old learns things. It's just more conscious as you get older. Yeah.
I think that was actually our last question. Any parting words?
No. I mean, I think if you came to this, I hope that this was informative. When Kelly asked me to give, she was like, you should talk about how the research bears on Montessori. I was like, I have kind of heterodox view on this, where I think it's like pretty good for Montessori, but not definitive. Are you okay with me saying that? And like, I actually think that this is what's interesting and exciting. I'm about to be a parent for the first time. It's like you get to be a scientist and kind of explore this and learn about your children, and in a broader sense of scientists, and that's part of the fun. And you know, it's an exciting time when the research just doesn't give you straightforward answers. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed my talk. Thank you for coming.
We have one parting comment. It says, thank you for helping digest the science as it applies to the choices we've made for our children's education and future.
You're very welcome.
All right, thanks, Matt.
Bye, guys.
Bye.